The question of whether Africans discovered America before Europeans is one of the most hotly debated topics in historical scholarship. Conventional historical narratives credit Christopher Columbus with the discovery of America in 1492. However, various scholars, particularly those focusing on African and alternative histories, argue that Africans may have made contact with the Americas long before Columbus. The idea that Africans crossed the Atlantic Ocean and influenced pre-Columbian civilizations challenges entrenched Eurocentric historical interpretations. In this comprehensive exploration, we will examine the evidence, including African maritime technologies, ancient accounts, cultural artifacts, and genetic traces, to evaluate the plausibility of the theory that Africans reached the Americas before Europeans. A key aspect of the debate surrounding whether Africans discovered America first lies in the maritime capabilities of ancient African civilizations. Critics of the theory often dismiss the notion of early transatlantic travel by claiming that Africans lacked the navigational and shipbuilding skills required to make such a journey. However, historical evidence suggests that African civilizations, particularly in West Africa, were highly skilled in maritime activities. The Kingdom of Mali, which flourished in West Africa during the 13th and 14th centuries, provides one of the most compelling examples of African maritime knowledge. Oral and written historical records suggest that Musa Abubakari, one of the rulers of Mali, may have embarked on a transatlantic voyage long before Columbus. According to Arab historian al-Ammari, Musa Abubakari was fascinated by the ocean and believed that it led to other lands. In the early 14th century, he is said to have commissioned a fleet of 200 ships to explore what lay beyond the Atlantic. While the results of this expedition are shrouded in mystery, the ambition and scale of the journey demonstrate that West Africans had the resources, shipbuilding techniques, and curiosity to undertake long-distance oceanic voyages. Moreover, the Carthaginians, who lived in North Africa, were renowned for their seafaring prowess. Some historians suggest that Carthaginian sailors may have ventured far beyond the Mediterranean, potentially even reaching the Americas. Ancient texts by authors such as Pliny the Elder mention extensive Carthaginian voyages along the West African coast, and some scholars argue that Carthaginians could have followed the currents westward to the Americas. In addition to maritime capabilities, ancient accounts provide tantalizing hints that Africans may have reached the Americas long before European explorers. One of the most well-known of these accounts comes from the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, who documented the journeys of Phoenician sailors in the 5th century BCE. Although Herodotus' works focus primarily on Mediterranean and African civilizations, some scholars suggest that his descriptions of distant lands hint at early African knowledge of lands across the Atlantic. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder also provides intriguing clues in his writings. In his Natural History, Pliny mentions an expedition by the Carthaginians that allegedly reached lands far to the west. While Pliny's account does not explicitly mention America, the vague descriptions of new lands have led some to speculate that Carthaginian explorers might have reached the Americas or at least had knowledge of its existence through African sailors. Similarly, Arabic sources contain references to transatlantic voyages. The aforementioned account of Musa Abubakari II's expedition is just one example. Arab geographers and historians, such as Ibn Khaldun and al-Idrisi, noted the trading relationships between West Africa and far-off lands, and some Arabic texts contain references to lands beyond the Atlantic. While these references are often indirect, they suggest that the possibility of distant lands, possibly including the Americas, was not unknown to African and Arab scholars. Cultural artifacts and archaeological discoveries are often cited by proponents of the theory that Africans reached the Americas before Columbus. One of the most famous pieces of evidence comes from the Olmec civilization, which thrived in Mesoamerica from approximately 1500 BCE to 400 BCE. The Olmecs are known for their colossal stone heads, some of which feature distinctly African facial features. These heads have sparked considerable debate, as some scholars argue that they represent evidence of African presence in the Americas. They point to the broad noses, full lips, and facial structure of the heads as clear indications that Africans had contact with the Olmecs, possibly influencing their society. Other artifacts have been found throughout Central and South America that appear to show African influence. For instance, in 1974, Dr. Ivan van Sertima, a prominent scholar of African history, published his groundbreaking book, They Came Before Columbus, in which he argued that African explorers made contact with the Americas centuries before Europeans. Van Sertima cites linguistic, botanical, and cultural evidence to support his theory. He points to African crops such as yams and bananas, which are believed to have been present in the Americas before Columbus' arrival, as potential proof of early African influence. Additionally, Van Sertima highlights pre-Columbian statues and pottery from Central and South America that resemble African art, further bolstering his case for transatlantic contact. However, critics of Van Sertima's work argue that the presence of African-like features in Olmec art could be a result of artistic style rather than actual contact with Africans. Furthermore, some scholars contend that African crops may have arrived in the Americas via other routes, such as the Indian Ocean or Asia, rather than through direct African exploration. In recent years, advances in genetics and anthropology have provided new insights into the possibility of early African contact with the Americas. Some genetic studies have revealed traces of African ancestry in the indigenous populations of the Americas, which some proponents of the theory view as evidence of African migration. For example, in 2012, researchers published a study in the journal Nature that identified genetic markers in the genomes of Native American populations that are similar to those found in West African populations. While these markers could have been introduced through the transatlantic slave trade, some scholars argue that the presence of these markers in populations that were isolated from European contact suggests the more ancient origin. Anthropological evidence also points to potential African influences in early American civilizations. Some anthropologists have noted similarities between African and Native American cultural practices, such as ceremonial rites, architectural styles, and religious symbols. Although cultural diffusion can occur without direct contact, these similarities raise questions about the possibility of African cultural influence on pre-Columbian American societies. Another important factor that supports the possibility of African discovery of the Americas is the existence of favorable ocean currents that could have facilitated transatlantic travel. The Canary Current, for example, flows from the west coast of Africa toward the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. This current, combined with the powerful trade winds, would have made it possible for African sailors to reach the Americas without highly sophisticated navigational instruments. In fact, several historical records suggest that ancient seafarers knew how to utilize ocean currents and winds to their advantage. The possibility of Africans being carried across the Atlantic by ocean currents is supported by modern experiments. In 1970, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl launched an expedition called the Ra-2, in which he sailed a papyrus boat from Morocco to Barbados using ancient Egyptian techniques. The journey successfully demonstrated that ancient African sailors could have crossed the Atlantic with the technology available to them at the time. Additionally, African sailors may have had access to celestial navigation techniques. Like many ancient civilizations, Africans were keen observers of the stars and developed sophisticated methods for using the positions of celestial bodies to navigate across vast distances. This knowledge would have been crucial for any transatlantic voyage, especially when sailing out of sight of land for extended periods. Despite the evidence presented by proponents of the theory that Africans discovered America first, skepticism remains strong in mainstream historical and academic circles. Much of this skepticism can be attributed to entrenched Eurocentric views of history that have traditionally marginalized the contributions of non-European civilizations. For centuries, European colonial powers controlled the narrative of world history, often downplaying or outright ignoring the achievements of African civilizations. The idea that Africans might have discovered the Americas before Columbus challenges this narrative and forces historians to reevaluate long-held assumptions. Critics of the theory often point to the lack of concrete archaeological evidence, such as shipwrecks or written records, to refute the idea of African contact with the Americas. They argue that while cultural and genetic similarities might exist, these could be explained by other factors, such as post-Columbian contact, rather than pre-Columbian exploration. Moreover, Many critics view the theory as speculative and lacking the rigorous empirical evidence needed to support such a monumental claim. However, proponents of the theory argue that the absence of definitive archaeological evidence does not necessarily disprove African contact with the Americas. They point out that much of pre-Columbian history remains poorly understood, and significant discoveries are still being made. Additionally, they argue that the Eurocentric bias of historical scholarship has led to a dismissal of African contributions to world history.